Alright, so now we're going to move on from absolutist theory to the actual practice of absolutism. So it's one thing to actually have a theory, putting it in practice or some sort of useful manner is just a whole nother animal. So now, looking at the 17th century, 1600s, and the actual use of the theory of absolutism forwarded by Thomas Hobbes, they basically took this theory and they developed three strategies to try implement this theory of absolutism. And it's not going to work unless they can actually apply these three different strategies to actually accomplish it. You really can't apply one strategy and really accomplish the full scope of absolutism. So, these strategies are one, to either eliminate or weaken a national assembly. Now, National Assembly is something like Congress or Parliament. Of course, the United States doesn't exist at this time, so we're looking at Parliament in Britain, for example, or Parlement in France. There's other assemblies in other areas as well, but that is the first stage. Completely wiping out a National Assembly isn't necessarily going to be something that happens. Generally, it's going to be a weakening of the structure rather than completely wiping it off and having a clean slate. So typically, it's going to be a weakening of the National Assembly, although the core objective is to, of course, eliminate it altogether. The second strategy is to make the nobility or barons or the very wealthy branch of citizens in the social structure, making them loyal to the monarchy or the king. In some cases it's going to be the queen, but in most cases it's going to be the king. Now, there can be different methods on how to bring this loyalty together, but typically in the Middle Ages, for example, the king and the nobility worked together. In some cases, the nobility are actually going to be more powerful than the king. But at least at this period of time, the king is fairly powerful. Generally has more power than some of the nobles, but that's not always the case. So, gaining loyalty and having the nobility be dependent on the king is the overall objective. In some cases, it's going to be accomplished, in some cases, not so much. If you're able to do this, then you can control basically the group of people who have the wealth. So that's the main objective. With that, then you have the king being the top number one individual in that country or state. Then finally, the third strategy is to control the administrative machinery of the state or country, and then using that to enforce any policy the monarch can think of. That could be laws, it could be any sort of decree, taxation, so on and so forth. Now, what I mean by administrative machinery is, well, that could be the military, that could be taxation or collection of taxes, that can be citizenship, any sort of bureaucratic arm of a state. It could be departments, for example, Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, Labor, Internal Services, and so on and so forth, to bring some of the more modern departments in the United States for some familiarity purposes. So you're going to bring all three of these together, and there certainly are different ways that some monarchs are going to go about it. It's not always going to be the same. But if you can bring all these together and actually make them work, then hopefully you're successful, and then you have an absolute state where you have complete power. Alright, now before we get into the actual countries that apply some of these strategies, I want to get into the warfare of the day. Now, warfare is going to be very important for these monarchs. And that's in part because warfare and this concept of warfare comes from the Middle Ages. The monarchs have this belief, and it's in their psyche, that to show power and that you deserve royal power, you need to be a strong military leader. and you need to expand and be successful on the field of battle. This comes from the Middle Ages. This is how you proved yourself to be a man. In some cases, also to prove yourself to wed maybe a potential different country's princess, for example. So it's very important. Also, it helps keep the lords and the barons, anyone who might be opposing you internally as well as externally, in line. So being successful in warfare is very important. Now, it doesn't mean you have to wipe the other state completely off of the face of the earth. It could be winning a few battles, maybe getting a few towns in the war. That could be meaning success. Or defeating the other army is a success. So, it varies. But some sort of success on the battlefield is important. Now, in the 1600s, slightly different atmosphere than what we had in the Middle Ages. For example, it's seen that soldiers needed to constantly be around. You needed them to certainly invade other countries, states, or any sort of other opposing force. You needed them to defend your holdings. That was important. So basically soldiers were year-round. You needed them all the time. You didn't know when a war was going to break out. So in the 1600s, you have the rise of standing armies. What I mean by standing armies is these armies are going to be around full-time. Before this period of time, certainly for the most part in the Middle Ages, not completely, there are some groups, for example the Swiss, and in some cases in French history there were standing armies, and in the 100 Years' War you also saw some brief periods of where the British had some standing armies as well. But certainly from the 1600s onward, you had full-time military forces. In Europe, you had not seen a standing full-time military force, at least in large, since the Roman Empire. So that's quite some time. So, you needed them all the time in case of invasion. You also needed them to fight the wars. You needed them to also maintain order at home. If there is a rebellion of peasants, or if there's nobles trying to grab power away from the king, you're going to use this army to crush the rebellion. Using force, they're viewed as enemies of the state. So it's not like today where if there is a protest against any sort of political issues, today we typically don't shoot them down. We let them protest peacefully, and it might last a week, 2 weeks, a month, or longer, but we generally don't shoot them to pieces. In the 1600s, they did. They wiped them completely out. They were seen as a threat to the state, a potential army, an upset to the social structure, and so they were shot to pieces. So you need soldiers to do that. So all of this basically fed into the idea that a standing army was necessary. And so if you look at the fact that you need an army to fight the wars, defend against opposing armies that may appear at any day, really, and also to keep peace at home, all of those factors encouraged a full-time professional military. So, we have the idea of a full-time military. In the Middle Ages, and certainly prior to 1600, they were basically like the National Guard. Maybe once a month or every weekend they would get together, they would practice, and then they'd go home and be farmers. And with the advancement of technology, which I'll get into here in a bit, standing armies were necessary for the huge amount of training that were necessary. But before I get into the technology, population was also increasing during this period of time. For example, around the beginning of 1600, you had maybe a typical large army might be 40,000 soldiers, a pretty sizable force during that period of time, and a force that could probably defeat most armies. But by the end, or certainly during the middle of the 1600s, you would see France, for example, fielding 400,000 troops. Massive amounts of people. So wars got far more violent, affected larger areas, and was a massive drain on the state itself. Now, as far as the technology is concerned and why we have these large armies, during the Middle Ages, you had swords, you had maces, you had axes, bows and arrows, and crossbows. All of this equipment required a certain amount of training, and it was very expensive. And the expense of getting this equipment was put on the actual soldiers themselves. So that's typically why the knights would have swords, and the peasants would pretty much grab anything they could, relatively cheap equipment. So spears, pikes, maybe axes, multi-purpose weapons. For example, you can use an axe to chop down trees in your business, or you can use an axe to chop someone's head off in the field of battle. During the 1600s onward, they needed soldiers, so the state started supplying weapons out of the budget of the state itself. So now soldiers don't need to buy their own equipment. Certainly this isn't a rule across the board, but in France, for example, for the most part, they would supply the troops with weapons. Now, the kinds of weapons that were used from the 1600s onward is going to be firearms. Gunpowder comes about, certainly towards the end of the Middle Ages, but now in the 1600s, you have muskets. Muskets have round balls. They don't have the form that we see today in modern militaries. But basically, the problem with these muskets is it takes a while to reload these guns. And they're not very accurate. You might be accurate to about 50 yards. That's about it. And this is the reason why you have massive formations, basically pointing their guns in the same direction, firing, not particularly aiming at a particular individual, but just aiming at another group of people. Because aiming was essentially pointless. Just point the weapon in the right direction, and hopefully you'll hit something with a volume of fire. Now, the advantage of rifles, or muskets in this case, is they're cheap. They're cheap to produce and cheap to train individuals. So, for example, it might take months or years to train somebody how to use a crossbow or a bow and arrow, how to aim it right, to get the arc to hit somebody from 100 yards away or longer. Muskets, on the other hand, put the round in, put the gunpowder in, and certainly stick the tinder in, and so you can light it and fire the weapon. Very simple, very easy. It's going to take 5-10 minutes to train someone how to use a musket. So now you can train massive amounts of people how to use these firearms. You're going to have them full-time to train them into the formations, to basically aim the weapon, to which formations to form, and how to react as an army, as hopefully a coherent unit. So that's in part the reason why you have such huge armies towards certainly the 1700s, is now you're not going to take a couple of years training each individual. Now you're going to basically take 5-10 minutes, train the person how to use the firearm, and then off to battle you go. Large amounts of people firing these weapons. One of the consequences of this is mounted combat. The knights of the Middle Ages are going to decline because they can rush at you. They're going to be training basically all their life. They might have 20 years of experience knowing how to use a sword, but then you run into a mass of maybe 100, 200,000 people. They're all going to point their weapons in your general direction. You're just not going to do very well. The horse is also not going to like it if it survives a volley anyway. A lot of loud noises. It's very frightening. And there's a lot of smoke as well, which just adds to the confusion. So mounted combat like that is going to decline. So that's basically the armies. But all of this is going to be very, very expensive. You have to pay these people year-round. You're going to have to supply the weapons, the equipment, in some cases uniforms, food, and so on and so forth. And then you're going to have to get them to train how to form a formation, point their weapons in the right direction, fire, move around, defensive, offensive maneuvers. All this takes quite a bit of time. So you're going to need to pay these troops year-round. All this very, very expensive, and that's the key point here. So, only large states could fund these huge armies, but this was the way war was going to be fought from here on out. States tried to find new ways to fund these militaries. They also tried to increase administration to get more taxes to fund these armies. So, for example, in wartime, it might take 80% of a state's budget to facilitate a war, to pay all these troops to do their jobs. So war was incredibly expensive. And this was one of the primary motivations for an absolutist state by some of these monarchs. It was their job to expand power, to show everyone off that they are successful and they are men in the European continent. So how you did that was the same way they did in the Middle Ages. And this is going to be very expensive, and we're going to see, for example, how that all pans out. So I'll leave that to another talk. Thank you.